Do you see the message, the recording? Okay.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming to this panel. My name is Kihara-Hunt. I'm at the University of Tokyo, and I also serve for ACONS as a secretary. So first, we would like to thank you, Hasso-san. Thank you. So first, I would like to invite Dr. Otto Spears of China Institute of Boundary and Ocean Studies, based in Wuhan, to give presentation. And after that, we will have a short discussion from Dr. Nisha. Okay, please, Otto.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to share my screen. I see that it's working well. So I will present about value-based norms as foundation for the pursuit of health in global solidarity. So I don't know if all of you attended the first plenary meeting, and there too, this was a kind of a theme. So I will build from what we heard there. So a crisis is a terrible time to predict the future, wrote Simon Chesterman recently. Because exceptional cases make bad law, all lawyers know that. But a crisis has also proved many times in history to be a very fertile ground for change. So a crisis is sort of a test for the international community. And we are definitely facing a crisis today, the coronavirus crisis. So the main assumption of my paper is that fighting the virus can actually be a good opportunity or give us a good opportunity to demonstrate global solidarity in the fight against a common enemy. And then also, I would assume a central role for the United Nations. And indeed, the UN is already assuming a central role in this fight. On the 2nd of April 2020, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution called Global Solidarity to Fight the Coronavirus Disease. And since then, it has adopted a lot of resolutions calling for similar expressions and demonstrations of solidarity. And my argument, and this is something new that we did not really hear in the plenary, is that this is nothing new, that this is what the United Nations has been doing since 1945. The United Nations has always used principles and norms of international law based on globally shared values as a legal basis for efforts to tackle global evils and do so in global solidarity. And fighting the virus is just the next chapter in this common story that already began in 1945. So the structure of the remainder of my presentation, first I will say a bit more about what these global values are, that are the foundation of this effort, and also say something about the role of the United Nations and international law in promoting these values. And then I will look at health as a particular challenge that has to be met. So what are global values? Global values, in my view, are globally shared beliefs that the world is lacking something and that there is something we can do about it. So values describe an achievable alternative. So I will look at some important characteristics of global values. And I've deliberately already showed you all these pictures so that you can start wondering what they mean. I'm now going to explain to you what they mean. So each of these pictures represents a particular characteristic of global values. So global values are globally shared beliefs. They are not facts that can be discovered like a shiny diamond hidden in a cave somewhere. They are beliefs. So they only come to the fore through constant conversation and discussion and achieve an effort to reach consensus. Second, the pursuit of global values is based on a belief in progress. Attempts to define global values as globally shared beliefs in a better world are based on the idea that we are making progress, but there will always be something to improve. So we're constantly making progress. And this is something that has often been disputed. I mean, is the world really getting better and better and better? I will get back to that in a minute. The third characteristic is that global values should describe a better world and not a perfect world. And so they are like the carrot that we hold in front of the donkey's nose, urging it to move forward. If we hold the carrot too far from the donkey's nose, it will give up and stop chasing the carrot. If we hold it too close, the donkey will just eat the carrot. So the ideals should be achievable, but not be too easy to achieve. We have to find a sort of middle way. Finally, we have to make sure that our global values indeed describe a better world and do not lead us into an abyss. There's some ideas of what the perfect world would look like actually turn out to be terrible ideas when they are implemented and realized. So that is what I want to say about values. And of course, there are reasons to be skeptical about this pursuit of global values in global solidarity. And we did hear some skepticism at the plenary yesterday. So is it worth all the trouble to make the world better? I mean, do we actually make progress? It certainly seems so. We have abolished slavery, colonialism. We have prohibited war as a means to settle international disputes. So that all seems to be that we're on the right track. Or is making the world better a Sisyphean task, i.e. a task that we will continue to undertake, but we will never accomplish it because once we have eliminated one evil, another one emerges and we will never accomplish this task. So how do we find these values? And I think I don't really need to explain to you now that values, they manifest themselves best when there is a obvious lack in the world. And so during the Second World War, obviously the value was peace. When there's poverty, obviously the value is equality. And now that we are witnessing a virus, obviously health is a value. And when we are witnessing environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, climate change, and so on, nobody needs to be convinced that a healthy environment is something worth striving for in global solidarity. So I now turn to the role of the United Nations in the pursuit of these values. So the UN has a very particular role in this effort. Basically, the UN provides a forum, a town meeting of the world, in which this discussion about values is taking place and organized. But then once a consensus has been achieved on these values, the UN also provides opportunities to translate this language of values into the language of international law with binding rights and obligations. And then the UN also has some possibilities to ensure the implementation of this international law. But we all know that the UN is actually terrible at enforcing its norms, at ensuring compliance with international law. That's not the UN's main strength. It's very bad at this. It's often said that the UN is just a paper tiger with no real teeth. Even the Security Council doesn't really accomplish much and so on. And I think that's true. And this is something we have to face and understand and not argue against. So the added value of the United Nations is not ensuring compliance with international law, but rather facilitating this dialogue or discussion about what is lacking in the world and how to make it a little bit better. And that is already a major accomplishment, that this consensus has been achieved in a considerable detail. So the UN's strength is this town meeting of the world. It provides a forum where representatives of all states get together to discuss what is wrong and what could be better about the world. Of course, I am very aware about representation issues, especially in the past, but also today. Not every single person in the world is fairly represented at the UN. I'm very aware of this problem. So let's now look at health. I have maybe 1 or 2 minutes to do so, and that's enough. So the various politicians have already identified health as a value we're fighting for, and coronavirus as an evil that is threatening this value. And so, for example, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he said recently, COVID-19 does not care who we are, where we live, what we believe, or about any other distinction. And thus, we need every ounce of solidarity to tackle it together, end of quote. And Xi Jinping, the president of the People's Republic of China, has on many occasions emphasized the central role of the UN in this effort to jointly fight the virus. And my own Prime Minister, Prime Minister Rutte of the Netherlands, he recently made the statement that the epidemic has forced us to face facts. In times of crisis, we have to work together, look out for each other, support one another, not only our families, neighbors, and compatriots, but also other countries and peoples, regardless of the borders between us, because we are all in this together, end of quote. Of course, I'm aware that these words are not always accompanied with corresponding deeds. And so there's a real serious problem of vaccine nationalism. And so rich countries, 90% of the world population, 19, they have more than 50% of the vaccines at the moment. And vaccination, well, I mean, that's a problem, of course, and it seems very hard to persuade those rich countries, my own country included, that it is also in their own self-interest that the entire world is vaccinated. So it's not only a moral obligation to ensure this, but it's also in rich countries' own self-interest. Yeah, because group immunity of one nation does not really work, because new mutations of the virus emerge all over the world. So we thus need to vaccinate every single person in this world. And also patents must be released, vaccines must be produced everywhere in the world, and so on. So there's a lot of references to global solidarity in the fight against the coronavirus. And now we have to see this followed up with the corresponding action and deeds. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Spijkers. I would like to then invite Dr. Nisha Dhanraj. Sorry, Maharaja Agrasen Institute of Management Studies for a brief comment on this paper particularly.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Otto, for submission of your paper. Your paper, whatever I could understand, your paper has analyzed the actual and potential role of value-based purposes, norms, and principles as proclaimed by United Nations as a basis for the promotion of global solidarity in order to respond to the coronavirus outbreak. According to my knowledge, you well explained the concept of value-based norms and global solidarity. This is the strength of your paper. And apart from that, you discuss so well about United Nations General Assembly Declaration on COVID-19, their commitments towards international cooperation and multilateralism for coronavirus disease. And there are a few questions which I want to put before you. The first is what is your overall assessment on the working of United Nations on global solidarity? What areas, according to you, need to be improvised? Second, what are the possible challenges being faced in maintaining global solidarity according to you? And the third question is as you referred in your presentation as well as in your paper about COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund, what is your view about financial technical support to government by contributing to this fund? And the last but not least, I just want to understand that how the practices like combating climate change was put by you in relation to your topic that was put in the conclusion part. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, those are interesting questions, of course. So just in general about promoting global solidarity. Well, I'm a lawyer, huh? So I'm an international lawyer by training, and I'm also a professor of international law. So I'm primarily interested in the question, so what is global solidarity in international law? Is it a principle? Is it an obligation? And if so, what does it mean? And where do you find the source on which it is based? I mean, is there a treaty that obliges states to display global solidarity? And what does it mean? And so on. So my research is focused on that. And then I found that there is not really a principle of global solidarity, like a legal principle of global solidarity. But there is something that is crystallizing that sounds a little bit like principle of global solidarity. And then the main characteristic that I identified is that it basically obliges us to pay particular attention to the plight of the particularly vulnerable. So it sort of depends on what you're talking about. But in my paper, I noticed that very often when the UN General Assembly is calling for solidarity, it is calling on us to not forget marginalized groups, children, when it comes to climate change. So the group of particularly vulnerable people is sometimes, it depends. It's not always the same group. So that is, I think, when global solidarity really crystallizes into a legal principle, I think that will be the core of it, that we should not forget these particularly marginalized groups and what impact our policies have on them. Yeah, and so when you talk about COVID, yeah, so it's the same. It's when people are calling for global solidarity in the response to the coronavirus outbreak, they're telling us, don't just care about yourself, but also, yeah, do not forget the marginalized groups that maybe are not so good at claiming a right, but they're still entitled to special attention. Yeah, and then of course, well, what I said in my presentation already, I think that the UN is not so good at ensuring that states and other actors actually comply with the statements that they make. And I think the coronavirus is no exception. So we should not expect of the United Nations that it will oblige in one way or another that the rich states and the pharmaceutical companies, that they will just provide vaccines for free to everybody in this world. The UN cannot do that, and we should not expect this of the UN. And the UN was also never established to have such broad and sweeping powers. So that's not the UN's fault. And just final note, I think that's a good thing. I think if the United Nations would be this all-powerful entity that some people would like it to be, I think that would be terrible. Then it would be like a world dictatorship. So I'm actually very pleased that the UN is such a weak organization at compliance, and I think it should stay that way. Thank you.
Okay, I think dividing the time into 3, it would be like 25 minutes. So if there are any questions to Otto right now, then maybe we can take, and we have like 5 minutes, or discussion from other panelists. I thought it was quite interesting. I'm from human rights field, and I'm also in a law field, so I don't know if I can add much. But thinking about the economic, social, cultural rights, I mean, International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and the sort of state's obligation. Can we say obligation or responsibility? That's your argument. But to seek international cooperation in achieving ESCR. And does that kind of extend to international solidarity, global solidarity, sorry, to, you know, attend these crises, I guess? That's something that I was thinking of. And when you're
international cooperation is very important to handle this coronavirus.
And
yeah, so the Human Rights Council appointed this special rapporteur on the right to global solidarity. But, well, I don't want to be too critical, but I don't think that is going anywhere. Well, in my paper, I'm a little bit more optimistic about it. There's a whole section about the work of this rapporteur, but so far it's not really going anywhere.
Only the last part I could understand, like in the conclusion, the climate change. So I thought that to put the same, and I'll ask you. Anyway, you answer so nicely.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah. So in my conclusion, I say that maybe after we have dealt with the coronavirus, or maybe already today, we might want to display a similar degree of solidarity in fighting climate change, because we realize more and more that the effects of climate change are also not evenly distributed over the world, and that it's actually possible to identify also particularly vulnerable groups when it comes to climate change. And those groups also seem to be neglected. Yeah, so a similar problematic is also unfolding there when it comes to our global response to climate change.
Is there any question to Otto, or are we good? Okay.
From my side, it's over.
Sorry?
From my side, it's over.
Your side is over. Yes, I think it was, it's quite interesting to think about global solidarity. I just came from another international law forum, which was talking about global solidarity on COVID-19, and talking about different branches of international law being applicable. That's there's a lot that we can talk about, but maybe if there's any last comment, then we take, and maybe not. If not, we can move to invite Professor Katsuma. Okay, maybe. Thank you very much, Otto. Then if I can now invite Professor Yasushi Katsuma of Waseda University for his presentation.
Dr. Dhanraj, I'm very sorry for giving you such short time to read my paper, but it's good to meet you in person through this Zoom system. And can you see the slides well? Okay, great. So the topic of my paper is about East Asian cooperation for equitable access to health technologies, particularly vaccines, in the battle against COVID-19. And I have 5 points to make in this short presentation of 10 minutes. I have to use my, okay. So the first point I'd like to make is that although we can criticize the WHO, it is still an important multilateral platform for global health diplomacy. However, at the same time, we need to look at some other complementary approaches to work closely with other stakeholders. So that's my first point. The second point is about access to COVID-19 tools accelerator that was launched in April in 2000. And this shows that the multi-stakeholder platform is really important rather than using the bilateral negotiations and that many wealthy countries try to do with pharmaceutical companies and other actors in providing vaccines. Number 3, COVID-19 vaccine global access, COVAX facility, focusing on vaccine procurement and how we can facilitate the equitable access to vaccines. And the point 4 is about intellectual property that India and South Africa have been proposing and supported by many other countries. It's almost more than 100 countries supporting the IP waiver during the period of pandemics. And lastly, I'd like to summarize that how the countries in East Asia and more broadly speaking, maybe in countries in Asia Pacific can work together, promoting multilateral and multi-stakeholder approaches So the first point is that it's really important that we remind ourselves that the WHO is a different organization from the United Nations. It's a specialized agency through agreement with the United Nations since 1948. Sometimes we see lots of frictions between the United Nations on one hand and the WHO on the other hand. So that's my first point. And at the same time, as the health issues have become an issue of security in some cases, that sometimes the functional special agencies such as the WHO was not sufficient to address the issues that are politically more important, and that should be discussed at the Security Council at the time of the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And in some cases where the outbreak occurs in conflict-affected areas like Sierra Leone at the time of Ebola outbreak. But more recently, we talk about COVID-19 in Syria. Then we need to work closely with humanitarian organizations coordinated by Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The point 2 is about the ACT Accelerator, and this is, we were quite impressed that it was launched in April 2020, only a few months after the declaration of the public health emergency of international concern, and it's a multilateral platform to bring together government, scientists, businesses, civil society organizations, and other organizations. So this is, I think it's an excellent initiative. This is a kind of ad hoc arrangement specifically for COVID-19, but this can be more generalized as a more permanent arrangement. And it has 4 pillars, and one of them is the vaccine pillar, and the COVID-19 vaccine global access stands for this particular pillar. And the COVAX facility is for wealthy countries to procure vaccines through their own funds. However, there is a kind of additional arrangement called AMC, Advanced Market Commitment, which will allow us to provide vaccines to 92 lower, middle, and low income countries through development assistance from wealthy countries or donations from foundations like Gates Foundation. Right. So this is a very innovative arrangement to aim at more equitable access to vaccines. So looking at the COVAX, it makes investment across the board portfolio of promising vaccines candidates in order to make sure at-risk investment in manufacturing starts now. And now we have more than 100 initiatives, candidates supported by the COVAX. By pooling purchasing power from all countries, to participate in the COVAX facility can have rapid access to those of safe and effective vaccines as soon as they receive regulatory approval, because we have to make investment in many, many companies. Of course, we have now 5 approved, five products approved for emergency use, including Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and Sinopharm from China. But we never know which company is going to be successful. So it's better to invest in more than 100 companies, right? In East Asia, we have Brunei, China, Japan, Singapore, Korea, that have signed commitment agreements such as self-financing participants. So these countries can finance for their own procurement in East Asia, and they can purchase up to 20% of the population. Although some of these countries may already negotiate bilateral purchase agreements with the pharmaceutical companies, but it will help us hedge the risk in vaccine procurement. If let's say Japan sign a contract with one company, but if that company does not deliver a product, then we may have to go to this bilateral channel just to hedge the risk. And looking at the AMC, Advanced Market Commitment, in East Asia, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Myanmar, Philippines, Timor-Leste, Vietnam, they are eligible to participate in COVAX AMC. So they may not be able to pay for their own vaccines, but wealthy countries or foundations can make commitments so that they can receive vaccines. So this is a kind of a development assistance, development cooperation arrangement. And this is targeted to the 92 countries. And high-income countries are encouraged to make financial contributions. And actually, on the first week of this month, there was a COVAX AMC summit held, and the commitment, big commitment was made. And the pleasant surprise was the United States of America came back to this arrangement, although the previous government denied participating in this arrangement, but the current government is now happily supporting this arrangement, which is a very good news for us. And although it was previously supposed to support 20% of the population of these developing countries, but now, thanks to the commitment made at this summit, now up to 30% of the population can be covered, which is good, but not sufficient, of course, to reach herd immunity, the kind of group protection. When we have more than half of the population protected, then that transmission can be interrupted. Another topic is about intellectual property, because we face supply constraints. And of course, the bad news is that the AstraZeneca production in India has been stagnant due to the pandemic in the country, and we keep suffering the supply constraint. And at the WTO TRIPS Council, this intellectual property waiver has been discussed, and it will allow all countries to choose to neither grant nor enforce patents and other IP-related COVID-19 tests, treatments, and vaccines. And so this is bold proposal, but this is not the first time to talk about it, because when we suffered from HIV/AIDS badly, and the negotiation took place to adopt the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and public health, and we need to prioritize public health over corporate interest in the battle against HIV/AIDS, and that can be repeated again for COVID-19. However, pharmaceutical industry has been resisting very strongly in this negotiation. Recently, when we talk about the WHO reform, Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response released a report, and so this is the the topic for in this area now, because each government is really looking at each of the proposal, and I'm part of this the process within the Japanese government, but I think the proposal has many interesting elements, but related to the intellectual property, I think what the majority voice seems to be the voluntary licensing instead of IP waiver. And of course, this is something to be debated, of course, in the next couple of months. But I think the majority, I mean, I'm talking about the mainstream voice, is to promote voluntary licensing. But of course, if we depend on voluntary licensing, we never know if it's going to happen or not. Or the pharmaceutical companies can play a kind of a game whether to grant it or not in Latin America or in other regions. So I think the tendency has been that pharmaceutical companies try not to give licensing to Latin American countries. Lastly, I probably have to wrap up, but lastly, the regional cooperation in East Asia. We have we have been talking about it quite a while, but nothing really happening in this region for some reason. And of course, we have ASEAN Health Ministers meeting and ASEAN +3 Health Ministers meeting and a tripartite health meeting between Japan, Korea, China. We talk about it, but nothing really happens in a tangible manner. And the group of 20 is more interesting because now we see Russia, India, and European Union coming together to talk about important issues. So, but here again, they talk about voluntary licensing. And it's really important for us in this region to, follow up on the commitment made at those diplomatic arenas, and we can possibly expand the discussion to a broader dimension, including maybe East Asian Summit, so that all the Asia Pacific countries can discuss about the common problems. So that's, I think, the area we try to push for. Yes, UN is really important, but when we talk about the problem to solve at the regional level, then we really need to talk about that in this region. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for taking a bit, maybe 2 minutes more than I should. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Katsuma. I'm just wondering, Dr. Nisha, because Professor Simões, Simões' presentation is closely related, would you like to do the comments after two presentations?
Yes, I can start. Shall I?
I'm wondering if we should do all together after.
Okay. Yeah. Sure.
Should we do that? Okay. Okay, so if I could invite Professor Fernando Simões of the Chinese University of Hong Kong for his presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Hello, everyone. I'm going to be discussing, of course, we have been hearing a lot about international coordination to fight the pandemic. But we should start by thinking that this is not the first time the world has faced a pandemic, and unfortunately, it will not surely be the last time. And so the international community has, for a long time, for more than 150 years, been trying to find ways and legal frameworks to promote international coordination in the response to global disease. Namely, and currently through the international health regulations created by the World Health Organization, and which allowed the organization to declare the emergence of a public health emergency of international concern, and in that context, issue temporary recommendations that are addressed to states regarding how they should respond to these health threats. These recommendations, of course, are based on scientific principles and scientific information, and very importantly, for the purposes of my presentation, they should not be more restrictive of international traffic and trade than necessary to achieve an appropriate level of health protection. The problem is that these temporary recommendations, as we all know, were disregarded by the vast majority of countries. So we all know that practically all countries around the world at some point decided to close their borders. And some even went as far as closing their borders to their own citizens. And depriving, for instance, foreign citizens from leaving the country, which may, in my opinion, breach the international pact on civil and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, namely the human right to freedom of movement. So basically, my discussion in this paper is about how to increase the efficiency of the international health regulations, taking into account that, as mentioned by the first speaker, enforcement of international law is clearly very weak And these recommendations are a kind of soft law because they are not really binding. They do not foresee any type of sanctions for states that decide to disregard the World Health Organization advice. So basically what I do is to discuss different measures that I believe the World Health Organization can adopt to boost its role as a global health orchestrator, as an organization that takes on this role of promoting global health. The first measure is to enhance the effectiveness of temporary recommendations, not necessarily by making them binding. We all know how difficult it is to enforce international law. We all know that states do not like to be pushed around, and we all know that even soft law obligations are vastly disregarded. So no point in trying to believe that states would ever reach an agreement to bind themselves to just follow the recommendations of the World Health Organization. It is true that the World Health Organization exercises scientific authority in this domain. It is true that it can request states to provide the health justification for the so-called additional health measures, so health measures that go beyond the temporary recommendations of the World Health Organization, which never suggested, never recommended closing borders. And an easier way to achieve this, in my opinion, would be to try to make them more credible. And this also has to do with the
What's wrong with Fernando, sir?
I think you are back. I think you are back, Professor. Sorry, you are muted. I'm trying to ask you to unmute.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry for that. As I was saying, the original temporary recommendation, even though it did not recommend states to adopt any additional health measures and did not suggest that states implement travel restrictions, it used very broad language, did not really provide a clear and detailed justification. So of course, you can, at least in the first period, understand that states were anxious and were fearful of the spread of the disease, as we all saw. In addition, these temporary recommendations were not very context specific. So they were really very broad statements about justifying the declaration of a pandemic. And you only hear about travel restrictions to basically say that they are not recommended. So in order to make them more effective, the World Health Organization should try to find ways to rebuild trust. And if we learn from the lessons of behavioral science, we know that in this case, the World Health Organization acts as a sort of choice architect. So it is providing information to decision makers at the national level. Countries that have to decide, facing a lot of pressure, political pressure and social pressure, what should we do in face of a pandemic? And previous studies on pandemics tell us that the knee-jerk reaction of most states around the world is just to close down the border because it's a cheap measure that works very well with local population because it believes that by sealing the border, it's possible to contain the virus, which medical studies show is not true. In any case, behavioral science tells us that all humans and also decision makers, for that matter, are subject to framing. So this means that the way the information is conveyed influences people's decisions. So if temporary recommendations are too abstract, too vague, or poorly outlined, of course, they may not be very effective. It is true that, in my opinion, states bear the burden of justifying why they deviate from the responses that were suggested and recommended by the World Health Organization. But the World Health Organization also has the duty to explain why it is adopting those measures and recommending those measures in the first place. I also suggest what I call some complementary therapies. First, a change in terms of human resources. The truth is that traditionally, the World Health Organization is mostly staffed with medical professionals, not really legal experts. They are clearly a minority. And this probably diminishes the capacity of the organization secretariat to provide legal advice to states. So my suggestion is to involve more lawyers with different backgrounds, for instance, in international law and in human rights in its workforce. More attention also needs to be devoted to who are the addressees of these recommendations. Normally, these decisions are not taken at the national level by health officials, but rather by different ministries. And they may not be particularly aware of the state's obligations under the international health regulations. There should also be more room for diplomatic cooperation. So going beyond legal rules, diplomacy, of course, plays an important role in this regard. And we all know that some countries clearly close their borders to other countries, for instance, or to people coming from other countries as a retaliation because other countries also did the same. So this leads to a domino effect that doesn't really benefit anyone. So to conclude, I argue that the World Health Organization has, for different reasons that I discuss in my paper, been punching below its normative weight. It is a global orchestrator in the health domain. It is the leading organization at the global level on the field of health. And it needs to pay more attention to international law frameworks, even if not strictly binding, even if they are just treated by states as mere recommendations. The way recommendations are conveyed to states may be not a panacea, of course, in the future, but at least it can contribute to a more coordinated response and alleviate some of the unnecessary suffering that, in my opinion, was caused by some extreme measures. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, if I can invite Dr. Nisha Dhanraj Dewani for comments for these papers,
sure.
please.
So first of all, I want to start with Yasushi Katsuma. If I'm wrong to pronounce your name, I'm so sorry. So basically the strength of this paper is what I found a very great synchronization of your thought on defining the concept of global pandemic. You went step by step for everything. And the topic like taken by you for ACT Accelerator and Global Access COVAX facility, regional cooperation among East Asian countries to promote multilateral and multi-stakeholder approaches were very relevant to your topic. Apart from that, you included TRIPS and Doha Declaration role through IPR. That was like you covered the entire topic so well. Now the question which I want to pose before you, the first is, do you think TRIPS waiver of Article 1, 4, 5 and 7, which are actually an issue right now, is actually a solution for global vaccination drive as G7 meet somewhat was also in favor of the same? And second question is what are your suggestions for East Asian countries in order to promote multilateral and multi-stakeholder approaches towards the global battle against COVID-19? And the last, I just want to raise what are your recommendations for international health regulation for handling this pandemic situation? So this is all about Professor Katsuma, and now I want to go for the paper which was submitted by Professor Fernando. So if I talk about the strength of this paper, Professor Fernando has well explained the provisions of international health regulation along with the interface between Article 43 and Article 26, 28, Article 30 in relation to implementation of health measures. And also the gap between WHO recommendation and state parties' response was well understood through your paper. Now, the question which I wanted to ask, the first is what is your strong recommendation for international health regulation that can be directed towards WHO for tackling the global health issues for the third wave of COVID-19, which is expected to come? And the second issue is what are the potential challenges with the international health regulation implementation, as you put in your paper, that the weakness of international health regulation in achieving its stated purpose is the use of non-binding recommendations. And the third question is how populism can impact the international health regulation, and conversely, how the international health regulation may be able to address the populist concern if the global community commits to helping states address the public health threats that emerge within their borders. So, from my side, these are the things which I wanted to put.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nisha. Should we ask Professor Katsuma first to give some responses?
Thank you very much for your excellent questions. The first point on the IP waiver is the question. The question is that is the IP waiver going to solve all the problems of vaccine availability? Yes, you are correct that we are now talking about new technologies such as messenger RNA. We have new technology used for vaccine production for the first time. And so, just waiving intellectual property is not going to allow other pharmaceutical companies to produce the generic products. You need to ask pharmaceutical companies to provide technical assistance to those other companies, whether through licensing at the favorable rate of remuneration, etc. So it's really important that we do not want to confront with the pharmaceutical companies. We want collaboration as a part of the social responsibility to work together so that we see modest profits for pharmaceutical companies that have been heavily supported by public funding so far, and also the availability of vaccines to be expanded to many African and Latin American, South Asian countries. So yes, the answer is IP waiver alone will not be sufficient, and technical assistance should be promoted in collaboration with the pharmaceutical companies. Collaboration in East Asia. Now, what seems to be the problem in East Asia? I think there are a number of tensions we find. One visible example can be Taiwan as a territory, and when Taiwan asks for vaccines, is it okay for Japan to provide vaccines to Taiwan, or Taiwan should be supported by Beijing? I think we have some tensions in terms of who support who, right? And so these problems can be an obstacle for regional cooperation. But my point is that we have to work beyond the politics. We are all suffering from this pandemic. So let's go beyond politics, and let's support all countries and territories such as Taiwan. IHR. So yes, we need to fix international health regulations, particularly in terms of the compliance mechanism, because IHR has been revised to accommodate a number of lessons learned we identified in SARS and MERS and other pandemics we had in the last few decades. However, just like as any international legal instruments, there is no good enforcement mechanism. So even when we talk about core capacities of IHR, many countries do not comply with this core do not have the core capacities, even for basic surveillance, right? So we have to make sure that member states with the WHO will work more committed to comply with the IHR. Also, then the most difficult part is the reporting obligation. When a country does not want to report what's happening in that territory, does the WHO have a kind of the authority to investigate the the situation when the country is not accommodating the guest? And so that's a big question. So that's why we are now talking about in a pandemic treaty, whether a pandemic treaty is a solution for that. My guess is that yes, we need IHR still as part of the WHO constitution. However, it may be useful for us to have a kind of a independent pandemic treaty to be signed and ratified by member states who accept all the obligations listed in the pandemic treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Katsuma. Can I invite Professor Fernando Diaz Simões for response?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, Professor Nisha, for your questions. If I got it right, the first question was basically how can the World Health Organization address the problem of travel restrictions in future waves of COVID? I don't believe that's possible. During COVID, I don't really expect states' behavior to change that much. Actually, if you go through all of the recommendations that the World Health Organization issued over the last month, while in the first few recommendations, they kept repeating more or less with the same language and explaining, we don't recommend travel restrictions. Then later they started saying, even if states implement them, it should only be, they are only effective if they are applied immediately and before the virus is within the borders, but still they have to be complemented with other measures, such as the ones that we suggested. And at some point, the World Health Organization simply stopped talking about it. So this may also be acknowledgement that states were not really listening to that. So I believe, and there are authors who also believe that in the beginning, the initial statements were clearly not enough to calm down states. And at some point, the World Health Organization seems to also have acknowledged this by just simply stop talking about this and using more flexible language, suggesting that in some cases they may work. I didn't get the second question, but I'll turn to the third one and we can come back to that. I believe the third question was how to ensure greater coordination when we have problems such as populism, for instance. Yes. I was honest. I was honestly surprised when I started reading the medical literature because it's common sense. It seems to be common sense. It works. If you close the door, it doesn't get in. And medical studies consistently explain, no, it doesn't work. At most, it works if it's implemented immediately and while infection levels are non-existent or very, very low. So at most it works within 1 or 2 weeks. And this is actually very easy to understand because the longest flight between any 2 points in the world is around 32 hours. The period of incubation is longer than that. So someone may already have brought the disease into your country. Of course, you can say, oh, yeah, it works in some countries, for instance, island nations. Yeah, it doesn't mean it works for everyone. Just think about countries with porous borders like in Europe. What I believe can be done is to address this border mentality, to address this cheap but useless measure that is only used, in my opinion, to calm down domestic audiences, is to be more, is to use greater pedagogy, greater coordination between medical staff. Let the epidemiology experts talk, not really the politicians. I think in many countries, including my own country, Portugal, PR has been a disaster. The way politicians and the policymakers talk to the population is not really very effective. It doesn't really convey a clear message. And there are I'll just finish on this note that I think should give us time for reflection. There are studies demonstrating that people, if you ask people, and studies have been conducted after COVID, if you ask a lot of people in surveys, are you against lockdowns? The majority of the people will say, I am against lockdowns. What about travel restrictions? What about closing borders? The majority is in favor. So they believe my right to freedom of movement should not be constrained in my own neighborhood, in my own city, because I want to keep on living. But it's okay if foreigners, it's okay if migrants are deprived from going back to their places, are deprived from seeing their families, because international travel is a luxury. I think that's the problem with border mentality. Not really sure this answers your questions.
Yeah.
But I don't want to use too much
yes,
time.
you answered so well, because this question was dealing with the populism and plus how it can be like in the context of public health threats. So you answer so well. My second question actually was it was like what are the potential challenges with the implementation of international health regulation? As it was put in your paper that the weak part of international health regulation is that there is a recommendation regulation, but those are not binding. So I wanted to ask this to you. What is your own opinion? What the challenges IHR has to face with the implementation part?
Thank you. Those challenges have been identified several times before in previous pandemics. The international health regulations and public health emergencies of international concern have been declared already 6 times under the current international health regulations. So since 2005, most of us never lived through a pandemic, but they have been around. Sometimes we forget about that. The problem now is that this one touches everyone. This one is really global. The problems have essentially to do with the fact that the international health regulations are not binding. They do not foresee any sanctions. So it pays off not to comply. And even if some states or individuals or anyone feels affected by the breach of those rules, there's really no dispute settlement mechanism, at least not binding. So even if one state, for instance, everyone is doing the same, so no one's going to point fingers. But if a nation, for instance, felt affected by the decision of another country to close their borders, they would not have recourse to any binding dispute settlement mechanism. They would have to agree by consensus. They would have to consent on, for instance, international arbitration or something like that. So this is why the international health regulations are really like soft law. Because I'm not very optimistic that they could turn into hard law, I suggest a process of hardening the law, hardening the regulations by increasing their clarity. And by indirect ways of making them more effective. So For instance, they are too generic, they are too vague. Exactly what type of travel restrictions, for instance, go beyond what are additional what can be considered as an additional health measure? When are they excessive? When are they not proportionate? You don't have answer to those questions.
When they are reasonable, in fact.
Yeah. So a lot of vague concepts. Yeah. So I'm instead of being optimistic that countries will agree to a binding treaty, like a global convention on how to fight against diseases, I think more realistically, maybe we should try to reach some type of consensus, even if it's not black letter law, some type of consensus on these soft law instruments, because frequently soft law instruments are the first step towards hard binding and hardening or harder international obligations. So I think the suggestions that I make try to work around the problem by, for instance, increasing the level of interaction between public health officials and the World Health Organization and departments at the national level that decide on these measures. So it's not necessarily bringing lawyers into the room. It's using the international legal framework that exists in a more efficient way.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We have about 9 minutes, so if you have any question, then let us know. But I have a few questions that I can put on put to you as well, and then maybe we can ask two of you to have last thought on your paper. One is about the WHO. WHO, as you mentioned, Katsuma Sensei, is a special agency, and it's you mentioned that there is a little different problem between the UN and WHO. So what does that bring to this particular issue? So is it does it add the difficulty of dealing with COVID and similar pandemics? And maybe this is for Professor Fernando, but what if there are different sort of contradicting demands within the UN, including WHO in this case, WHO and UN, especially, for example, health, certain human rights, for example, right to privacy or freedom of movement, trade. How does that work? Then maybe another question I had was about geopolitics of East Asia. Maybe that's Katsuma Sensei. So how does that work on a cooperation with the international organization like the UN or WHO? Maybe sometimes rivalry work, maybe sometimes, not having a regional, effective regional organization work for cooperation with international organization, but I'm just wondering what you think about that. And another thing I wondered with Professor Fernando is you mentioned that implementation is a problem. So isn't it also the problem of implementing soft law, or is it a different, is it very different? So that's just myself, but if there's anything else, then do let us know. Otherwise, maybe I can ask Katsuma Sensei first for like three minutes or so, 3-4 minutes.
Thank you for good points. WHO, United Nations, and other specialized agencies. I think what we are becoming more aware is that the WHO alone cannot solve many of the problems. WHO is a very good normative framework for health ministers of the member states to agree on certain direction of global health. However, travel restrictions or intellectual property, we have other specialized agencies such as WTO and aviation, ICAO, and other organizations. And of course, Japan was surprised to receive an international cruise ship called the Diamond Princess with COVID-19 patients docked at the Yokohama port. So we're now talking about how the law of sea can be accommodate such a problem in partnership with IHR and other legal systems as International Labour Organization, seafarers' rights protection. So I think it's more complicated, and when it had the certain disease has a very broader repercussion in other social sectors. So I think rather than asking the WHO to do everything, we have to ask WHO to work together with other organizations. The UN cannot be the only solution, although there is a proposal to set up a new council called Global Health Security Council or something. However, I don't think putting everything within the United Nations can be a bit dangerous for politicization of a number of normative issues within the UN platform. Yes, so that's my first point. The second point, I think in this region, we have two powerful countries that have developed COVID-19 vaccines. Russia has the Sputnik 5, name of vaccines, they called it Sputnik, but and of course, China has a number of vaccine candidates, among which Sinopharm is now approved by the WHO as on the emergency use listing. However, the problem seems to be that these two countries are tempted to use those vaccines for diplomatic tools, and we often talk about vaccine diplomacy. Sometimes the vaccines can be used for diplomatic tools, asking a country to cut the relationship with Taiwan, for example. So that's, I think we probably need to agree on certain norms that, health, we should support health intervention beyond the politics, and vaccines as, we should treat vaccines as international public goods rather than like any other commercial products. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then Professor Fernando.
Thank you so much for the two very interesting questions. Regarding the first question, I would follow up on Professor Katsuma. I agree that the United Nations can't do everything. This is not just about health. This is about politics. This is about trade. This is about travel. So of course, as you mentioned, you may have contradicting demands and conflicting interests being discussed at United Nations level. And it is exactly the rationale of the international health regulations has been historically to balance the protection of public health with trade and travel concerns. So to make sure that countries would not adopt excessive health measures and therefore, for instance, create barriers or unnecessary barriers to trade and travel. We all know that we have a World Trade Organization, so there's a very well established international regime on trade and trying to put down borders between countries when it comes to free trade, but we don't have any equivalent when it comes to travel. And as a colleague of mine told me, when your lifestyle as an expat, for instance, depends on the ability to travel, that's when you really realize that it is almost, I would say, as important nowadays for the global economy as free trade. But we don't have an international agreement on free travel. So we need to strike a compromise. We need to strike a balance between these different interests. I'm not downplaying the importance and the severity of the crisis, of course. I'm also concerned about health, of course. And another dimension that has been forgotten is also human rights, of course, because there's also weak enforcement at the human rights level, at the human rights dimension. I have discussed these issues in two different papers, and I would be happy to send them through if you want. The second question has to do with implementation of soft law. Of course, it's also difficult, but the idea when you focus on hardening soft law instruments, it's not my expression, it has been used quite frequently in the literature, is the idea that clarity matters. And through persuasion and through voluntary compromise, maybe instead of just imposing certain rules that countries will refuse to do, because of course this is one of the key remnants of nation states, even in a globalized world. The concept of sovereignty, the concept of borders. As a European, I was shocked to see that we still had borders from Portugal to Spain and all over Europe. I just think it's useless, especially when both countries have high levels of infection, and that, for instance, it would be much more effective, instead of having police patrolling the border, to allocate those resources to really adopt measures from a scientific point of view that can make a difference, like putting more resources into hospitals and medical staff.
Thank you very much, both speakers and Dr. Nisha, for very interesting discussion. I'm sorry, I have exceeded. I'm not being scolded by the admin person, so I've exceeded 1 minute over. But thank you very much for this panel, and we would hope to to meet you virtually in other panels and the plenary. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you very
much.
much.
Thank you so
Bye
much.
bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.